All right. So does Minnesota need to draft a corner at 25? Like, is it mandated? That is what we go over today. But I have a ton of numbers. I'll try to keep it reasonably paced. So we're going to go over Rhodes and Waynes first, as you know they are the main culprits here. Rhodes first. He had 6 pass deflections. He was targeted 81 times, allowed 66 catches. 81.5% of those was completed. Allowed 791 yards, 12 yards of completion, 9.8 yards a target. Allowed 4 touchdowns on the year, and allowed a quarterback rating of 123.8 when throwing at Xavier Rhodes. Trey Waynes had more pass deflections with 8. He had a lot more targets at 96. He allowed 71 catches for 74% for 719 yards, 10.1 yards per completion, 7.5 yards a target. He allowed 5 scores and a quarterback rating of 107.9. And yeah, those are the 2 main problems here, at least for this last season. I think Rhodes is more far gone than Waynes is. Waynes is kind of interesting in the sense you could argue that was just one bad season. And then you get to Mackenzie Alexander, who is also a pending free agent, just like Trey Waynes. He had 5 pass deflections, was targeted 58 times, allowed 38 catches, 65.5%. And that's actually pretty decent. Generally, like, you're doing all right if you're between 60 and 66, 67. Well, that's when you start to get to a gray area, I guess. But usually 60 to 65, if you're in that kind of range, you're usually doing all right. So 65.5% really isn't that bad. He only allowed 324 yards, 8.5 yards per completion, only 5.6 yards per attempt. He did allow 2 scores, but he allowed a quarterback rating of 84.3, which is well below the average of around, I think it's 92. That's, I think, the average quarterback rating, so that's well below. Mike Hughes, he had 9 pass deflections. He was targeted 67 times for allowed 41 catches on that, 61.2%, 484 yards allowed, 11.8 yards per completion on him, 7.2 yards per target. He allowed 3 scores and a quarterback rating of 91.9, so he's right on the threshold of that average. So Holton Hill is a little interesting. I have both his 2019 and 2018 ones just because I feel like later on to prove my point I'm going to need those 2018 numbers. But in 2019 he had 1 pass deflection. He was only targeted 9 times. 6 of those were completed, 66.7%, 70 yards, 11.7 yards per completion, 7.8 yards per target, didn't allow a touchdown. So that's a 90 quarterback rating against him. In 2018, when he wasn't suspended half the year, you had 7 pass deflections, had 24 targets, only 13 catches, 54.2%, 142 yards, 10.9 yards per completion, 5.9 yards per target. He allowed 1 touchdown and had a quarterback rating of 68.4 when he was thrown at. And then Chris Boyd at the end of this year kind of got some playing time, mainly in that Bears game. He had 1 pass deflection, 13 targets, 9 completions, 69.2%, 93 yards, 10.3 yards per completion, 7.2 yards per attempt, didn't allow a score, and 89.6 quarterback rating. That one's a very small sample size, but he was depth and he played, and I was like, we might as well throw him in. And I really do think the key to this entire question of whether we should be drafting one at 25 or not actually lies in Mackenzie Alexander, which some might not come to that conclusion. But I think if he's able to be retained, that would allow Mike Hughes to go over to the outside corner where he's played better, and that's more of his natural spot. That's where he played in college. And considering this was his first year back from the ACL, you should be expecting him to improve upon that and kind of come back more healthy. And that's usually what happens with these ACL injuries. It usually takes that second year removed until they start to really look like themselves again. So we should see improvement from him. And if we're not trying to teach him the nickel spot, which is actually really weird in the Zimmer defense, because if you watch it, he likes to bracket coverage with the two linebackers in the middle with Barr and Kendricks. So what he does is he kind of tells his nickels to give up the inside, which is the biggest no-no for a nickel. But in the Zimmer defense, it's trained that way, I think, because they've all done it, and he doesn't change it. So that tells me him as a secondary guy probably wants that to happen. And that kind of allows them to deal more with fades and corner routes from the nickel and the slot, and less of the whole kind of Edelman coming over the middle kind of thing, because pretty much the plan is to zone him off to the linebackers. So whether or not you agree with that is different, but it's kind of how it works from what I've kind of studied from it. And not having to teach a nickel the opposite thing of what you're supposed to do again, especially one that might not be a natural nickel, although has a skill set that could be a nickel in Mike Hughes. I think it would be more beneficial to find a way to keep Alexander among Waynes and Alexander, because I think you can replace Waynes with Hughes potentially. So, yeah. But the opposite of normal doesn't really do that. And Hill did show promise in 2018, but then was suspended for half of 2019 for two separate cases. So it was like, it was an 8-game suspension essentially. And a lot of Hill comes back to the use of marijuana. And he was kicked off of Texas for it at the time in college, despite being kind of like around the league, kind of viewed as this like third round type of guy in terms of his talent. But he had a lot of those character issues where he was kicked off the team, and there was a reoccurring marijuana thing, and so he went undrafted and we picked him up. And then obviously we got now the marijuana problems of this because he was suspended half the year. But I feel like it's worth mentioning, if we can get this CBA to actually go under before this season, we might have our Rhodes replacement already in Holton Hill, because he is a very physical press man corner, and that's kind of his deal, and he's only, I think, 23 next season. So much, much younger, and doesn't have the wear and tear of all the injuries. And the new CBA looks like they're modernizing this a little bit, in the sense that they are getting rid of those marijuana suspensions. So we might already have our Rhodes replacement in-house. We could have our Waynes replacement in-house with Hughes. And if you can continue to, just bring Alexander back, if it's possible, you might just have a young, talented corner group there with those three. And so if Alexander's re-signed, I don't think it necessarily mandates a corner at 25. Obviously, you still need to address it probably, because you do have depth issues at that point. But it definitely makes it more of a second, third, maybe fourth round kind of need, depending of how things play out. And you can, maybe you can even attempt to trade up for like a falling tackle, or maybe one just falls to you, or things like that. You might be able to focus on the line. Maybe if you lose Anthony Harris or Everson Griffin to free agency, all of a sudden you can draft, a Grant Delpit or a Gross Matos, or something like that. And it kind of opens things up, I think, for the first round of things, if you can at least keep Alexander, because you already have a guy who knows the nickel. As where with the other way, if you lose Alexander, they will now probably have to teach either Mike Hughes or draft a guy there to learn the nickel. And now you have a rookie corner that hasn't been in the league at all, really, and now it's kind of like, who do you rotate him with, and things like that, which you still kind of ask with the second and third round kind of guy, but you're not as dependent on them as where you might just be kind of banking on the Hill thing, which could potentially be banking on a new CBA, but I don't think it would mandate it if we can just re-sign Alexander and you can hold off a little bit. That is my thought on that. I'd like to know your thoughts down below. Always wanted, community interaction. And anyway, liking and subscribing always helps. Until next time, I bid y'all adieu.